It's been a year since Russia's President Vladimir Putin announced what he called the special military operation in Ukraine, leading to the largest war in Europe since World War II. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has led a commemoration service in the capital Kyiv. Ceremonies are also being held in other cities across Ukraine to remember the thousands of people who lost their lives and the millions who've been forced from their homes since the start of the conflict. Let's bring in Al Jazeera's Charles Stratford, who's in Brovary, to the east of Kyiv. Charles, tell us what happened there.
Yes, Adrian, you join us, as you say, in the town of Brovary. It's about 15 kilometres behind me to the outskirts of the capital, Kyiv. And it's around about 100 kilometres in that direction to the Belarus border, where it's understood that a couple of days into the war, a tank column, a Russian tank column, came down this road and was trapped in the town of Brovary and heavily ambushed by Ukrainian forces. Video appeared of this that was released by the Ukrainian military a few days into the war, and many military analysts will tell you that it's a graphic indication of some of the kind of failures that Russia had in the early stages of this war. The Ukrainians tried basically to take out both the lead vehicle and the back vehicle in this Russian tank column in a bid to try and trap the column. That didn't work. It wasn't 100% successful, but analysts are still baffled to this day as to why Russian forces would have used a main artery, a main road like this, so exposed, to try and push into Kyiv without, for example, the help of infantry to try and push back any kind of ambush. And that video that you're looking at there was very much set the tone, if you like, for the kind of defeat that Russian forces suffered in their attempts to take control of Kyiv. And of course, it was under a month later that Russian forces were forced to withdraw back out of this area. Meanwhile, we know that there is heavy fighting continuing on the eastern front lines in the Donbass region, specifically around that flashpoint town of Bakhmut, where we understand that there have been heavy casualties suffered on both sides, that fighting being ongoing for months. We heard from the Wagner Group a couple of days ago. They announced that they had got the ammunition that they'd been asking for, so we understand that those clashes are intensifying all the time. Interestingly, also, Russian forces claiming that they've taken control of a small town just to the north of Bakhmut, attempting to surround it. We know that they've taken control of the southern villages as well. There's also a lot of heavy fighting around Avdiivka in Donetsk as well, and Liman as well, which is close to the Lugansk regional border, where Donetsk and Lugansk actually meet. This has been a flashpoint. Liman was actually retaken control of by the Ukrainians in the late autumn. This fighting an indication that Russians are obviously trying to push Ukrainian forces back. Now, we've been looking at the battlefront since Russia's invasion a year ago today, and this is our report.
On February the 24th, 2022, as the first wave of Russian troops crossed the border, as Russian missiles struck, it fast became clear that Vladimir Putin's insistence that he would not invade Ukraine had been a lie. It was a multi-pronged attack. Russian forces crossed from Belarus and advanced towards Kyiv. There was a similar push in the northeast. And in the east, towards Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv. At the same time, mainly pro-Russia separatist forces attacked towns in Ukrainian-controlled areas of Donetsk and Lugansk. The Ukrainian president, not yet in his trademark military fatigues, called for help.
I had a conversation with US President Joe Biden. The US is starting to gather international support.
Poor planning and brave Ukrainian defense quickly scuppered Putin's immediate plans to take Kyiv. Russian army columns were soon bogged down and smashed.
The enemy poorly calculated their communications and logistic needs, and their supply warehouses were across the border. This meant that after 2 days they were stopped without fuel, ammunition and food, and they lost the effective management of their troops.
On the 1st of April, Ukraine announced it had recaptured the entire region around Kyiv. Dead civilians, some with their hands bound behind their backs, were discovered, seemingly where they had been shot. Russia was accused of war crimes. The Russian army, which Ukrainian intelligence says had planned on taking control of Kyiv in 3 days, had suffered a historic and humiliating defeat. In May, after months of intense fighting in the port city of Mariupol, the last remaining Ukrainian fighters surrendered at the Azovstal steel plant. But Ukraine by now was receiving what would become tens of billions of dollars worth of military aid. The autumn counter-offensive liberated tens of thousands of square kilometers, including the city of Kherson.
Preparations for the counter-offensive started in April. By June, when we had received Western weapons, we were better able to hit their supply lines, command centers, and weapons, and fuel depots. We could also attack the reserve troops as they approached the front line.
But since December, Ukrainian gains have slowed to a virtual standstill. Russia has made small advances in eastern Donbass using what Ukrainian forces say is wave after wave of infantry soldiers and mercenaries from the Wagner group. Some of the heaviest fighting continues around the town of Bakhmut, where many of the estimated 5,000 civilians who remain there refuse to be evacuated.
Officials here in Kyiv and their Western allies are convinced that Russia is about to launch what they describe as a spring offensive. More sophisticated weaponry, such as tanks, is on its way from NATO countries, but with no end in sight to the fighting. Many are asking just how long Ukraine's allies can fund this war, despite their leaders saying it is a fight for democracy they cannot lose. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera, Kyiv.
Well, the war has separated so many families. More than 8 million Ukrainian refugees have fled to neighboring countries. Most of them are women and children. Poland has welcomed the most, with around 1.5 million people settling there. Germany is hosting an estimated 1 million Ukrainian refugees, but like many countries, it's faced challenges, especially in providing proper housing and services. The Czech Republic took in around 500,000 people. It's one of 27 EU nations where Ukrainians are allowed to live and work for up to 3 years. Italy, Spain, and the UK are also supporting Ukrainian refugees. Each has welcomed around 150,000 people. Antonio Vitorino is the Director General of the International Organization for Migration. He's with us now live in Geneva. Antonio, what are the IOM's priorities right now in Ukraine?
We focus above all in the fact that 17.6 million people inside Ukraine are in need of humanitarian assistance. And we do periodic surveys among them, and we have come to the conclusion that the highest demand from their side is cash. They need to have cash assistance to conduct their daily lives. Medicine, health, and psychosocial and mental support are also extremely relevant. And thirdly, we still are fighting against the winter. So sheltering people for the winter, giving them warm clothes and eating facilities is extremely important because, as you know, the sheltering of the electric grid is raising the difficulties of people to resist to the very low temperatures in the field. Those are indeed the priorities of assistance that we have today.
And Antonio, that's the people who are here who are internally displaced. Do you have any idea, though, how many people have left Ukraine and how many of those who did leave have returned over the past year?
Yeah, we think that 8 million people have left Ukraine to the neighboring countries. And in the last year, roughly there are still 5.5 million internally displaced people, which means people that live in a different place than their place of origin inside Ukraine. And there are 5.5 million returnees too, of which 20%, which means roughly 1 million and above 1 million, have come from abroad. But let me emphasize one point. Even those who return to their places of origin are in need of humanitarian assistance. 65% of the people that have returned to their places of origin have seen their houses destroyed or significantly damaged. And therefore, they need shelter, they need food support, they need water, they need electricity. So they are in need as any other internally displaced people, in spite of the fact that they have returned to their places of origin.
There seems to be a lot of speculation, Antonio, that an escalation in fighting is imminent. What are the IOM's plans to deal with that, especially if Russia gains more territory, given that humanitarian needs are reportedly so much greater in Russian-held areas?
Let me be very clear on this point. The decision of the UN system, of all UN system, is to stay and deliver. And of course, the fate of the war is unpredictable. That's why we need flexible funding. Flexible funding is very important to allow us to adapt to whatever might happen, to any eventual evolution of the war. The challenge that we have is to have access to the people in need. And that depends also on the evolution of the fighting between the two countries. And we have a duty of care of our staff, of course, but we have been able to deliver humanitarian support to the people in the front line at high risks. So if there is a further escalation of the war, we will have to be prepared to adapt, to go on delivering assistance, and we have been procuring and prepositioning critical items of support to deal with any possible eventuality.
Antonio Vitorina, Director General of the International Organization for Migration. Many thanks indeed. The United Nations General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly in favor of a resolution calling on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. Moscow has faced criticism from many member states over alleged war crimes committed against civilians in the early days of the war. Natasha Butler reports now from Chernihiv.
The aftermath of a Russian attack in the northern Ukrainian city of Chernihiv last year. On the ground, bodies of civilians. They'd been queuing outside a shop for bread when they were hit by shells and rockets. 15 people were killed, dozens injured. So you were standing around here? Natasha narrowly escaped death that day by taking cover by this wall. She was in the queue with her son and mother-in-law. She plays me a recording she made on her phone.
We heard explosions near us. It was very close. And then we saw lots of people running everywhere.
At the time of the attack, Chernihiv was a city under siege. Russian forces were surrounding it and shelled it almost daily. They destroyed power and water supplies. Evidence of what happened is still visible nearly everywhere. This is where people were lining up for bread that day. It is right in the middle of a residential area. And what prosecutors in the city say is that what happened on that day is a war crime, an indiscriminate attack on civilians.
Law enforcement agencies consider this a war crime because the main victims were civilians. Also, a pre-trial investigation found no evidence of Ukrainian military hardware that could be a legitimate target. Weapons were used indiscriminately.
All these marks, yellow marks, are the places of where rockets hit the buildings, make this information.
Marina Slobodyanuk works with a rights organisation called Truth Hounds that's helping prosecutors to build a case. It's collated evidence and used open source material, satellite imagery and social media to reconstruct what happened. Her team says it's traced the killings to a Russian unit that was positioned on the outskirts of the city.
We identified also the commander of this brigade, Oleg Kurygin, who might be liable and responsible for this very kind of attack.
Whether Oleg Kurygin or another officer was responsible for the attack on the bread queue might never be proved. Some investigators say he's back in Russia. It's clear that building legal cases and prosecuting alleged war crimes is a challenge. But for some Ukrainians, pursuing justice is at least one way of honouring the war's many victims. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Chernihiv, Ukraine.
Let's go live now to Bucha, some 30 kilometers west of Kyiv. Al Jazeera's Hoda Abdelhamid joins us from there. Bucha, Hoda, one of the first places where we saw Russian atrocities against Ukrainian civilians. How does it feel a year later?
Well, certainly, I mean, we're standing here at one of the cemeteries on the outskirts of Bucha. Just a short while ago, there was a ceremony to commemorate soldiers who are dying on the front line, but also those who lost their lives during the Russian occupation of this area. It started actually on the 27th of February. On this day last year, on the 24th of February, Russian paratroopers were landing in an airport not very far from here, Hostomel, about 10-minute drive from Bucha, but it's only 3 days later that the tanks actually arrived here, and they stayed more until the 31st of March. Now, when they pulled out, Ukraine and actually the world discovered the scale of what happened in Bucha. If you remember those pictures of bodies strewn on the ground, abandoned there. Some of them were found with they had been blindfolded and executed point blank. There were mass graves that were discovered. In total, about 450 bodies, and out of those, at least a third showing signs of tortures. Bucha came to really represent the horrors of Russia's occupation, and it's from here really that Ukraine started building up its war crimes file, the Bucha chapter being a very big and extensive one, simply because when they arrived here, everything was so fresh and everything was so evident everywhere. I remember coming here in the weeks after the liberation of Bucha, and bodies were still being exhumed. We followed an investigation team throughout the day, and they were really going in side roads. They were receiving phone calls of people returning to their homes and finding graves in their backyards. It was a continuous exhumation, one after the other, and at the morgue, the bodies were just piling up, and some of the families were not here, the mothers and the children who had gone west, who had maybe crossed into Poland, so they had to come back to recognize these bodies before they could be buried. So it was certainly a very dark chapter for Bucha, and I think it's a chapter from which this town has still not recovered, as the full scale and the reconstruction of the horrors that happened here is ongoing.
Hoda, many thanks indeed. Hoda Abdelhamid there, live in Bucha, west of Kyiv. China has released its own 12-point proposal to end the conflict in Ukraine, following talks between top diplomat Wang Yi and Russia's President Vladimir Putin. We're going to take a closer look at that proposal now. Beijing is calling for an end to Western sanctions on Russia and has urged Moscow and Kyiv to hold peace talks. The plan calls for the establishment of humanitarian corridors for civilians, as well as steps to ensure that grain can be safely exported from the region. It also warns against the use of nuclear weapons in the conflict, as well as attacks on nuclear power plants. Shortly, we'll get reaction to the plan from Zain Basravi here in Kyiv, but first let's cross to Katrina Yu in Beijing. Katrina, can China be a reliable mediator in this conflict?
Well, Beijing believes so. It says that unlike the US or other Western European countries, it's not trying to change Russia or Ukraine. It says it's a neutral party that's only interested in ceasing hostilities and doing this via dialogue, not through sanctions or through arming Ukraine. Now, that's what Beijing says, but its actions point in a very different direction. China has so far failed to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and repeatedly we've seen Beijing tout its no-limits, rock-solid friendship with Russia. And over the past year, trade between the two countries has also soared. Not only that, we've had President Xi Jinping speak to Vladimir Putin at least 3 times in this past year. We know that the two are two personal friends, and he's also planning to visit Moscow later this year. And conversely, we have not had, as far as we know, any effort on Xi Jinping's part to reach out to Zelenskyy. Now, the US says that China's support of Russia could be going even further, that Beijing is planning or considering sending weapons to Russia for use in its war machine. But so far, this is something that Beijing denies.
Katrina, many thanks indeed. Let's bring in Zain Basravi then, who's also here in Kyiv. President Zelenskyy has spoken. Zain, what did he have to say? What's his reaction to this Chinese plan?
Well, the Ukrainian president as well as the foreign ministry have both said that they have communicated with China about the plan. They're aware of this proposal, and they say that this is a positive development, that China getting involved, that the idea of dialogue, all of these things are positive indicators. Now, this is very different from the reaction that Ukraine has had to other allies of Russia. They are staunchly critical of any Russian allies or anyone even sympathetic to Russia. Even the French leaders have gotten in trouble for trying to strike a bit of a balance. But when it comes to this, the Ukrainians, I think, recognize that you cannot isolate or not communicate with such a strong country. So they have welcomed it as a positive, but it's difficult to see how Ukraine and Russia, how they can find a middle ground when Ukraine has said very clearly that it is a red line for them, any territorial compromise. They want Donbass, and it is really difficult to see how China can strike any dialogue with that as a red line for Ukraine's government.
And Zain, what are people there saying about this one-year anniversary?
Well, it has been a very hard year for the Ukrainian people. We're at a church, and services happening at churches all over the country today to mark a year of war, a year of loss of life. Just behind me, we were inside the monastery, the St. Michael's Monastery, and people there lighting candles, praying for the departed, for those killed in this war, people praying for loved ones at the front line. We saw a troop of soldiers go in and offer prayers and then presumably head back out to their posts, possibly headed to fighting in the east. So people are really using this as a moment of reflection. Something interesting we heard from people just yesterday. People are sharing their photographs and their memories of the beginning of the war, the before and after of the destruction, but they've also been marking the 23rd of February as the day that was the last day of peace, sharing pictures of themselves on the last day of peace before this very long war. And they hope that their leaders are right when they say that the spring will bring decisive battles and that the war will be over this year. That is something not just the intelligence services of Ukraine or the government is talking about. That's something people are talking about as well. They want to return to civilian life. And they echo their leaders' voices when they say that it will end on their terms. A peace will come when Ukrainians are all returned to Ukraine, when the Ukrainian territory is returned into Ukrainian hands. And something we keep hearing from people is that Russia may have started this war, but Ukraine will end it, and it will end on Ukrainian terms.
Zain, many thanks indeed. Zain Basravi there in central Kyiv. That's all from Ukraine's capital for the moment. Let's get you back to Rob in Doha.
Adrian, thanks. We're going to go to Osama bin Javed now in Moscow. We're going to get a reaction to China's peace proposal. Osama, obviously this is the central focus at the moment. It's certainly coming out of Beijing. How is Russia feeling about this proposal from China?
Well, this is a proposal that Russia has welcomed ahead of it being launched, saying that China can prove its role to make sure that the conflict does not escalate. As the Western countries point fingers towards China being close to Russia, Russia has said that it is essentially the United States and its Western partners who are fanning the flames of war by providing weapons to Kyiv. So it is going to be interesting to see how exactly Russia reacts to this. So far, no official reaction since President Xi Jinping outlined this plan. But we all know that this is something that was essentially hand-delivered to President Vladimir Putin by China's top diplomat from the Chinese president. So Russia has welcomed it. But as the anniversary is today, we've heard from the Russian deputy chairman of the National Security Council, saying that this is a war which is going to continue until Russia wins it. Those assertions by the United States that it is Russia who should end the war, he called them lies. And Dmitry Medvedev says that Russia will continue to pursue denazification, as he likes to call it, of Ukraine, even if it has to go to the border with Poland.
We've been talking a lot over the last few minutes about the impact that this war has had on Ukraine, but clearly, of course, it's having an impact in Russia as well. We're seeing Russian soldiers dying. We're seeing people in Russia who are watching shops and large brands pulling out of their country. How are people in Russia feeling about this conflict a year on?
Well, in the past year, there were initial concerns about the people because essentially Ukrainians are very much tied into the society with Russia. People here have family members. They have very deep connections with Ukraine. But in the last year, this has been presented as a war which was inevitable for Russia. President Vladimir Putin has told his people that this is a war that Russia had to go to because it's not just fighting Ukraine, it's fighting for its territorial integrity because there was an amassing of Western weaponry, including some nuclear arsenal that was talked about coming into Ukraine. So this is something where the Russian people in the last year have come closer to. They can relate to it. They think that this is an inevitable war which their country had to fight. Obviously, they have felt the impact of this on the everyday life. But by and large, Russia continues to carry on. We've heard from President Vladimir Putin saying the West has failed to defeat them militarily, break their economy, or isolate them internationally. And this is something that resonates with the Russian people because even fast food chains, including McDonald's and Starbucks, are all operating, but with different names and Russian owners.
Osama bin Javed talking to us from Moscow. Osama, thank you very much indeed. And my colleague Adrian Finnegan is going to be back in half an hour with our special coverage of the Ukraine conflict, a year into the war. Now, we're marking the first anniversary with News Hours live from Kyiv at 11 GMT and 1600 GMT.